Thank you so much, and thank you to IMAP and also USAID for this opportunity for me to be actually one of the first speakers, or the first speaker actually, to talk about community engagement, because I think, like all of us here in this forum for the next 3 days, community engagement is at the heart of what we do. And I get the opportunity to actually speak about how it is at the core of humanitarian action. And without it, we would be unable to achieve the goals and the objectives of what we do in humanitarian action. So without further ado, I think David has already introduced me. I am based with UNICEF in the HQ team actually now, but I have worked for years in both the humanitarian space and public health emergencies, as well as different humanitarian contexts, as well as in the development sector in different regions, mainly South Asia, MENA region, and Africa, throughout Africa. So I'm really pleased to be able to share some of the work that we've been working on. And again, let me just stress and start off by saying that all the work that I'll be presenting today has been a lot of collaborative effort. That would never be possible without the efforts of many institutions and partners, both in the humanitarian academic space as well as the humanitarian practice space. And what I'll be talking about are some of the core global goods, and these are basically documents that have been developed, but that aim to influence policy change as well as implementation and action on the ground. So I'm going to jump right into it. If my slide moves. Okay.
I just wanted to start us off by just framing the discussion and what we are all aspiring to, which is already recognized within the 2030, the Sustainable Development Goal Agenda. I'm just going to minus my screen, sorry, so that I can see my presentation. And the 2030 agenda really grounds us within this community engagement and transformative and universal agenda in terms of change. And it really put an emphasis to recognize that in order to accelerate or make any progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals, this has to be a collective journey that grounds all the work that we do and bridges the gap between how we engage with people and communities, how we take action at that level, and how we actually acknowledge communities as assets. They are there, they continue to be there, they are resilient, we do not make them resilient. And so how do we think about participation, consultation, and engagement, framing it in a way that we recognize communities as assets and equal stakeholders? So having said that, this is in framing that dimension and recognizing them as assets, some of the challenges that I think we could say that are overarching, and this is just a very brief synthesis because there's so much literature out there that I wouldn't be able to do it justice within this short time frame, but just to say that in humanitarian and development practice, there are some core challenges that have influenced the role of community engagement, in particular in the recent decades. And when we think about public health emergencies and different types of humanitarian crisis. So within that, I'm not going to go through every single one of these challenges, but what I would like to say is that the way that we have been approaching it with partners, again, yes, I'm presenting on behalf of UNICEF, but this has been efforts of bilateral donors, Gates and other philanthropic organizations, INGOs like Save the Children, as well as the International Federation of the Red Cross, so many different institutions that have been there, as well as community-led platforms that we engage with as well in all our work. As you all know, UNICEF actually works within 150 countries. We program in those countries. And in those moments, we work with local government, as well as civil society, et cetera, as well as all of the partners that we all work with. So having said that, the challenge always has been that all these institutions and organizations and stakeholders and key actors that are involved in humanitarian action have very diverse understandings of community engagement, as well as what we aim to achieve through that. So while that poses an opportunity, it is a challenge. And so the work that we've been trying to do within this sector is how do we frame community engagement? How do we identify actions, develop standards that can hold us as institutions and stakeholders more accountable? And so the work that we'll be talking about today that I'll be presenting right now is reflecting a consensus that we reached amongst these different stakeholders and actors to say that there is a need to rethink community engagement from a governance perspective, from a development and a humanitarian and public health response perspective, in order for us to address structural and institutional change. So this is just to frame a little bit about, so when we think about community engagement and how do we center it, it is at the intersection of 5 global objectives. And I won't go into the full detail here because we'll be sharing the references to this, but at the end of the day, what we aim to do is to establish a common language amongst stakeholders to define what are the key community engagement principles, the actions, the goals, and benchmarks, and what are they linked to in terms of current development as well as humanitarian processes. And so where we find the intersection is looking at how does public sector take action? How do we engage with community systems? That crossroads between humanitarian to development, especially when we're thinking about preparedness action. How do we view data and how that data is generated? Remembering all the time that when we're talking also about data, particularly in community engagement, it is representing people. So the intersectional nature of community engagement practice, it requires meaningful integration of community engagement standards in all aspects of its practices. So when we think about the project cycles from an organizational perspective, from the methods that we do, from the participatory approaches, and more importantly, how is it financed and resourced? Because this is an investment if we really want to do proper community engagement in community systems. So I'm going to jump right into now talking about the standards that have been developed. These standards were aimed to address specific, this frames the principles basically of the framework to say that these standards will be intended to be used as a tool for development and humanitarian actors. But what do we really want to achieve and what do we mean by sector specific opportunities? So the goal is to create an enabling environment for community engagement approaches, whichever the approach is of the different organizations, to address 4 interconnected challenges. As I mentioned, there's a wide variety of approaches and interpretations of what constitutes quality community engagement and what constitutes quality community engagement at scale. So these 4 global principles that frame the framework recognize that, you know, not always is more community engagement necessarily better or safer. So how do we optimize what we do? When we have particularly a humanitarian crisis, flooding the community and overloading the community is not exactly what's best for communities, as we probably all know here. And then there are concerns over the effectiveness of the development and the humanitarian practice. And so it calls for greater accountability among the implementing agencies and partners, donors, as well as financial institutions and the governments, and of course the communities themselves. So in the case of community engagement, accountability demands that those responsible for community engagement fulfill the responsibility through transparency in their design, in implementation, and evaluation. And that helps us to harmonize our different approaches and deliver quality community engagement. So I'm going to give us a quick overview to the community engagement standards because they really are unique. These were developed over a 2-year process of many stakeholders, as I mentioned. The link is provided in this presentation so that you would be able to take a look at it, and please feel free to engage with us further because we really work with our partners also on how do we institutionalize this. So they are modeled on the IASC, the Interagency Standing Committee minimum standards. And we look at trying to develop 16 core minimum standards around community engagement. Why is it super unique? The core minimum standard, which is that pillar that you see in green, part A, looks at what is it that we want to deliver, the what that we want to deliver. We don't want to only think about community engagement as a means to the end, as usually sectors do, that we leverage community engagement platforms for WASH services or for health services, etc. But actually, how is participation and empowerment processes, how do we look at them more as an end and entrust communities, build their local capacity, and formulate interventions that would leverage the communities as assets? Then the three other parts, part B, part C, and part D, really look at the operationalization. And this is what is super unique about these community engagement standards. And when I talk about institutional and organizational change and accountability, and the organizations that worked on developing these standards, the commitment was there to say we need to not only do better on the what and how we define what we do for when we claim to do community engagement, but the how do we do it. And we need to ensure that it is integrated within all programming and planning phases. And so we have metrics around implementation. We also need standards to talk about coordination and integration. Who is leading from the government side? What kind of partnership coordination mechanism is there? When we think about also resources, what are the human resources that are there that we will rely on? It's not only frontline workers that are the ones that deliver or are accountable for community engagement processes. There's a whole range of community platforms. So when we think about human resources, what are there within sectors, but also what about the community structures? And then we come to the issues around data as well as resources. One of the things that I always like to say is, oftentimes when we think about community engagement, it always turns into a volunteer effort, right? So that communities need to take action for themselves, but we don't resource it, and we don't give time, capacity, and resources at the most decentralized level in order for communities to take actions on their own. What I would like to just say here, before I go to the next slide, is for every single one of these standards, what we worked on for the last few years was to develop a description of that standard, which is a rationale for it, develop a quality criteria around it, and then actions for how to operationalize that standard. And I'm just keeping with time. I don't see the chat box, so David, please interrupt me if I am getting close to the end. And then this is just a very quick example, just to say that, these are some of the types of questions that we aim to, and this is just a pure summary because it is way more detailed within the standards, and the document actually takes us through processes on what would be steps to take this forward. But this is just to say that these are some of the considerations when we're thinking about the application of the standards. We look at what are the processes that have been put in place, for example, when we're thinking about participation. And then when we think about inclusion, for example, how have we identified and set up mechanisms for inclusion and two-way communication and broader feedback? This is all to promote transparency and accountability, but in those processes of establishing mechanisms, and these are the key words here, it's not haphazard, it's not ad hoc. These are relationships and partnerships that we must build and foster over time and ensure that there is the right leadership involved, representation, diversity, etc. So this is just a descriptive example just to say that for part A, this is what we might be looking at when we're thinking about how to operationalize. And when I do share the presentation, we have a lot more in there, but please do take the opportunity to check out the community engagement minimum standards and reach out to us for more questions on them. So having framed that, just to say that was an innovative process to begin with, because bringing partners to the table around the same thing with the same challenges and trying to work through it to come across and agree on a common language, that was a big feat, right? And of course, this has come through and has evolved over time through the challenges that we always face on the ground in terms of what are our impacts and what are the outcomes, particularly from humanitarian processes. So out of this was born a new initiative, and this was actually funded by the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, USAID, in partnership with us. And it evolved during the COVID-19 crisis because there was so much happening within the PHE space. And the idea was, how do we bridge the learnings, the operations, the institutional accountabilities of what's happening at country level and how we engage with communities to take it to the next level and say, okay, so we need to improve community engagement practice. How do we better inform it by considering the broad range of social sciences that could help us to better our community engagement interventions. So this is just a really quick introduction, 2 slides, just to say that this initiative took us to the next level. I have an intervention on tomorrow, and I'll talk a little bit more about what this initiative brought to light, where we had this initiative implemented with more than 70 partners. IMAP was one of the core partners working with us, particularly on the data space. And this specific project had 3 objectives: to develop further technical guidance that all the partners, these 70 plus partners, would help us to strengthen the understanding of social sciences informing community engagement programming, and what's the range of that and how do we leverage that. Establishing shared principles amongst these organizations as well around ethics around community engagement, particularly around data and data sharing and codes of conduct. And then the last pillar was around data. How do we improve community engagement data, and how do we use that data, and what drives that pillar? And so this is my last slide, and I'll end on this. And this is, sorry for the very complex diagram, but it should be for us humanitarians very familiar. This is the humanitarian program cycle. And so with all the development of the additional guidance, what we are hoping is that this is operational. And that was the main goal of this objective of this project, that whatever we developed, that we would be able to use them as different institutions. And we would adopt them based on our institutional accountabilities, but that these instruments and tools would be usable and adaptable for us to use at different points in the humanitarian program cycle. So at preparedness, what would we use? During a response, how would we leverage specific tools during a needs assessment phase, for example? How would we use it during an implementation phase? How would we use it for resource mobilization, etc.? So that was the idea behind this project and all the global goods that we developed. And tomorrow I will go into a bit more details around what we were able to develop with the partners, and how we are hopefully all viewing this to take it to the next level, to elevate intentional resourced community engagement to improve and achieve humanitarian outcomes, but really basing this and anchoring it in working with communities, not for communities or to communities, but with communities. So I will pause here, and I think we have a few minutes maybe for just some questions, really quick questions. I might have went over time, I apologize for that. And I just some food for thought, and maybe colleagues will think about it by tomorrow and we can have a bigger conversation in the panel discussion. But what I would really like you all to walk away with is, in thinking about all of this, I think what we all struggle with as organizations is, how do we use this within our organizations and within our organizational mandates, and how do we apply these standards so that we can really elevate what we do with communities? I'll stop there.